A 14-year-old walked into court facing felony charges. By the time she left, the judge and prosecutor were the ones on trial. The courtroom felt colder than it should have been, not because of the air conditioning, but because of the way people were looking at her. Some with indifference, some with doubt, and a few with outright suspicion. At just 14 years old, Kennedy Price sat at the defendant's table, her hands resting in her lap, fingers barely twitching. The orange jumpsuit felt heavy on her shoulders, as if it was trying to suffocate her, but she kept her chin up. Her grandfather had taught her that much: never show fear. Across the room, Judge Richard Calloway adjusted his glasses and exhaled loudly, as if this entire proceeding was a waste of his time. His silver hair was combed back neatly, but there was something impatient in his posture, in the way he shuffled the papers in front of him. State of Tennessee versus Kennedy Price, the bailiff announced. Charge: felony theft and destruction of property. Felony. The word felt ridiculous, but no one in the room was laughing. The prosecutor, Malcolm Reed, stood up, his suit crisp, his voice steady. Your Honor, the evidence is clear. The defendant was caught on surveillance footage at Davidson and Compy Jewelry moments before the store's alarm was triggered. The footage shows her reaching into the display case. Minutes later, the store's entire security system was disabled, and a sapphire necklace worth $12,000 disappeared. We also have a witness who claims to have seen the defendant fleeing the scene. Kennedy didn't blink. She had heard this all before. Same words, same tone, same smugness. Her public defender, Thomas Lane, barely looked at her as he stood. Your Honor, my client is 14 years old. She has no history of criminal activity, no prior offences. None on record, Reed interjected. We don't know what she's been up to before this. Kennedy's fingers curled into her jumpsuit. Judge Calloway sighed. Let's not waste time. Does the defence have an argument, or are we going straight to witness testimony? Lane shifted awkwardly, flipping through his notes. My client was nowhere near the store when the theft occurred. Reed smirked. That's an interesting claim. Surveillance footage suggests otherwise. Kennedy finally spoke. Show it. The room fell silent. Calloway raised an eyebrow. Excuse me? Kennedy turned her head, looking directly at Reed. The footage, show it. The prosecutor hesitated for half a second before nodding at the bailiff. Moments later, a screen on the courtroom wall flickered to life. Grainy black and white footage played, showing the inside of the jewelry store. A girl in a hoodie stepped up to the counter, her face mostly obscured. Her height, her build, it could have been Kennedy. But Kennedy knew something the rest of the room didn't. She waited. Watched the girl in the video reach into the display case. Then Kennedy pointed at the screen. Pause it. Calloway narrowed his eyes but nodded. The bailiff froze the frame. Kennedy leaned forward. Look at her left hand. The room shifted, people squinting at the screen. The judge frowned. What about it? Kennedy turned to the jury. She's wearing a ring on her index finger. I don't wear rings. Lane blinked, clearly caught off guard. Reed's smirk faded. Kennedy didn't stop. And if you rewind a few seconds, you'll notice something else. Her shoes. They're too big and they don't match the way I walk. If you compare that to the footage from when I was arrested, you'll see a difference. Reed clenched his jaw. Circumstantial. Kennedy tilted her head. That's funny, because I thought prosecutors loved surveillance footage when it works in their favor. Calloway exhaled through his nose. He wasn't entertained, but he wasn't dismissing her either. But Kennedy wasn't finished. She had one more move to make, and this was the moment everything started to shift. Judge Calloway laced his fingers together, his expression unreadable. The courtroom had gone still, everyone waiting to see what he'd say next. You've got quite the sharp eye, Miss Price, he finally said, leaning back in his chair. But this isn't a game of spot the difference. You're on trial for felony theft. Kennedy didn't flinch. I know. A murmur rippled through the gallery. People weren't used to a kid speaking so confidently in a courtroom, especially not one in an orange jumpsuit. The judge sighed and looked at her attorney. "Mr. Lane, is your client's strategy to play detective? Because I have to say, that's a new one." Lane cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. No, Your Honor. We're trying to prove my client's innocence." Kennedy interrupted. "Isn't that the point of a trial?" Reed scoffed. "Cute." He turned to the judge. "Your Honor, the defendant is attempting to create reasonable doubt with technicalities. The fact remains she was seen at the scene." Kennedy cut in again. "Actually, I wasn't." The prosecutor's head snapped in her direction. Judge Calloway raised an eyebrow. "You're saying you weren't there?" "I'm saying your so-called witness is wrong." Reed's lips tightened. "Our witness is a store employee who swears they saw you running from the scene." Kennedy shrugged. "Then they're lying, or mistaken. Did they describe what I was wearing?" Reed hesitated. Kennedy turned to the jury. "Because if they said I was wearing this hoodie," she gestured to the grainy video still frozen on the screen, "then they're wrong. I don't own a hoodie like that, and if you check my arrest records, you'll see I was wearing something completely different when the police picked me up." The courtroom buzzed again. Judge Calloway exhaled sharply. "All right, enough." He looked at Kennedy, his eyes narrowing, as if assessing a puzzle he hadn't expected to find. "You clearly have something to say, so let's play a little game." Kennedy crossed her arms. "A game? Truth or lie?" the judge said. "I'll ask you some legal questions. You answer. If you're as smart as you think you are, this should be easy." Lane looked horrified. "Your Honor, I don't." Calloway ignored him. "Ready, Miss Price?" Kennedy glanced at her grandfather in the audience. He hadn't said a word since the trial started, but his face was calm, watching, waiting. She turned back to the judge. "Go ahead." Calloway tapped his fingers on the bench. "Burden of proof in a criminal case. Who holds it?" Kennedy didn't hesitate. "The prosecution. Standard, beyond a reasonable doubt." Calloway nodded slightly. "Miranda v. Arizona. What's its significance?" Kennedy smirked. "That's a trick question. It established the Miranda rights, but it was about more than that. It was about police coercion and the Fifth Amendment. You can't use a confession if the suspect wasn't properly informed of their rights." The judge's lips pressed into a thin line. Reed shifted in his seat. Calloway leaned forward. "Good. Now tell me, what's the exclusionary rule?" Kennedy didn't blink. "If evidence is obtained illegally, it can't be used in court. Map V's, Ohio, 1961. The gallery was no longer whispering, they were staring. Calloway tapped his gavel against the bench. "One last question. If you answer this right, I'll consider taking your claims more seriously." Kennedy squared her shoulders. The judge tilted his head. "When can a minor be tried as an adult in the state of Tennessee?" A slow smile spread across Kennedy's face. "Under Tennessee law, a minor can be transferred to adult court if they're over 14 and the offense is severe enough. Armed robbery, murder, things like that. But theft?" She shook her head. "Not unless there's a serious prior record, which I don't have." Calloway didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he looked at Reed. "Counselor, remind me, why are we treating this case like it's a felony?" Reed opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The courtroom shifted again. Kennedy had just made the judge question everything, but the prosecution wasn't going down without a fight. Reed's face hardened. He could feel the case slipping, and he wasn't about to let a 14-year-old make a fool of him. "Your Honor," he said, forcing a chuckle, "this is impressive, really. But let's not pretend this changes anything. She still fits the description. She was arrested a few blocks away. The witness saw her." Kennedy tilted her head. "The witness saw someone, but I have a question for you, Mr. Reed. When was the last time you actually listened to a witness instead of just using them?" Reed scoffed. "Excuse me?" Kennedy turned to the jury. "He's counting on you to assume I'm guilty because someone thinks they saw me. But eyewitness testimony is unreliable, especially under stress. Reed shook his head. And you're an expert now? Kennedy leaned forward. I don't have to be. The Supreme Court already said it for me. Perry v. New Hampshire, 2012. They ruled that eyewitness testimony can't always be trusted, especially when there's no police misconduct to back it up. Memories change. People fill in gaps. Sometimes they just see what they expect to see. The jury was paying attention now. Kennedy could tell some leaned forward. A few glanced at Reed. Judge Calloway exhaled through his nose. You're saying the witness might be mistaken? I'm saying it wouldn't be the first time. Reed's jaw tightened. That's speculation. Kennedy shrugged. And so is a bad ID. She turned back to the judge. Can I ask Mr. Reed a question? Calloway glanced between them. You may. Kennedy locked eyes with the prosecutor. Where's the missing necklace? Reed's mouth twitched. The courtroom was silent. Kennedy pressed on. You have no physical evidence, no stolen property, no fingerprints, no DNA, just a grainy video and a witness who thinks they saw me, but no actual proof. Reed gritted his teeth. We don't need the necklace to prove you took it. Kennedy raised an eyebrow. You should, because last time I checked, theft means taking something, and if you don't have what was stolen, how do you know I had it? Reed's face turned red. The jury can infer. Infer? So no real evidence, then? Judge Calloway adjusted his glasses. Counselor, does the state have any material evidence tying the defendant to the stolen property? Reed hesitated. We have the security footage. That doesn't clearly show her. Calloway cut in. Reed's lips parted. No words came out. Kennedy took a slow breath. So let me get this straight. You want to send a kid to juvenile detention over a crime you think she committed, based on a bad video and a shaky witness, with no stolen property, no real evidence, and no prior record. The words hung in the air. Reed clenched his jaw. We have enough. Kennedy let the silence stretch. Do you? No one moved. Even Calloway didn't speak for a moment. Then he shifted in his chair. I want to hear from this witness. Reed inhaled sharply. Your Honor, I said I want to hear from them, Calloway repeated, his voice steady. Kennedy's lips curled into a small smile, because now, for the first time, the judge wasn't just looking at her like a defendant. He was looking at her like someone who might be telling the truth. The courtroom doors opened, and a nervous-looking man in his late 50s stepped inside. He adjusted his glasses and wiped his palms on his slacks before taking the stand. Kennedy studied him. He was exactly what she expected, an ordinary store clerk who probably hadn't meant to get caught up in any of this, but now his testimony could decide her fate. Judge Calloway peered down at him. State your name for the record. Dennis Holloway, the man said, clearing his throat. Reed stood up, smoothing his tie. Mr. Holloway, you were working at Davidson and Compy on the night of the incident? Yes, sir. And did you see the defendant in or near the store that evening? Dennis nodded slowly. I believe I did. Reed smiled slightly, glancing toward the jury. Can you confirm it was her? Dennis shifted in his seat. I mean, it looked like her. Same height, same build. She had a hoodie on, and when she ran out, I only saw her for a second. Kennedy's lips parted slightly. That's it? She waited for her attorney to object, but Lane just scribbled notes on his legal pad, completely useless. Kennedy took a slow breath and turned to the judge. Can I ask Mr. Holloway something? Calloway hesitated, then with a small sigh, he nodded. Go ahead. Kennedy faced the witness. You said you saw someone in a hoodie? Dennis nodded. What color was it? The man blinked. Grey, I think. Kennedy turned to the jury, but the footage shows black. Reed shot up from his seat. Objection. The witness is recalling details from memory. Minor inconsistencies don't discredit his statement. Kennedy kept going. And when you saw the person run, where were you standing? Dennis fumbled. By the register. Which means the person was already outside when you got a look at them. Yes. Kennedy tilted her head. So you never actually saw them take anything? Dennis hesitated. Well, no, but I saw them run out, and the alarm went off right after. Kennedy nodded. So if someone ran out of a store and an alarm went off, would you assume they stole something? Dennis hesitated again. I mean, yes. Kennedy let the moment stretch. Then she turned to the jury. That's what this case is, an assumption. No one saw me take anything. No one found anything on me. There's no fingerprints, no DNA, no stolen necklace, just a guess. The jury was listening now. She could see it in their eyes. Reed slammed his hand on the table. The state isn't basing this case on assumptions. We have credible testimony. Kennedy lifted her eyebrows. Do you? Or do you have a man who thinks he saw something but actually saw nothing at all? Calloway exhaled loudly and rubbed his forehead. He looked at the prosecutor. Mr. Reed, do you have anything besides this testimony? Reed's jaw clenched. Your Honor, the evidence is non-existent, Calloway interrupted. Reed's face turned red. Calloway leaned back in his chair. You're asking this court to convict a minor based on weak eyewitness testimony and nothing else. That's not how this works. Kennedy's heart pounded in her chest. For the first time it felt like she might actually win. But the prosecution wasn't finished yet, and they were about to pull their last desperate move. Reed wasn't the type to lose gracefully. His face was tense, his fingers tapping against the table as he scrambled for a way to regain control. Then he straightened his tie and forced a calm expression. Your Honor, while I respect the court's concerns, I'd like to remind everyone that this is about more than just missing evidence. This is about accountability. Someone committed this crime. If it wasn't the defendant, then who? Kennedy inhaled sharply. There it was, the last trick in the book, shifting the burden of proof. She didn't wait for the judge to respond. Kennedy turned to the jury. That's not how the law works. Calloway glanced at her, but didn't interrupt. He's asking me to prove I'm innocent instead of proving I'm guilty, but that's his job. The burden of proof isn't on me, it's on the prosecution. If they can't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that I did this, then you have to acquit. Reed clenched his jaw. We've provided enough. Kennedy cut him off. No, you haven't. The jury was completely focused on her now. She could feel the weight of their eyes. She took a breath. This case isn't just about me. It's about how easy it is for someone to be accused of something with no real evidence. If I was someone else, someone older, someone with money, someone who didn't look like me, would we even be here right now? The words landed like a hammer. Judge Calloway cleared his throat, his expression unreadable. I believe we've heard enough. The jury will deliberate. Kennedy sat down slowly, her hands gripping her lap as the jury stood and filed out of the room. Time stretched. The courtroom buzzed quietly, people whispering, exchanging glances, but Kennedy stayed still, staring at the table in front of her. Minutes passed, then an hour. Then finally, the jury returned. Kennedy's heart pounded, but she didn't let it show. The foreman stood. We, the jury, find the defendant. He paused, taking a breath. Not guilty. The words crashed over her like a wave. There was a gasp from the gallery, the sound of her grandfather exhaling sharply. Reed slammed a file shut, his face stiff. Kennedy didn't move, didn't react right away. She was too used to expecting the worst, but then the relief hit her all at once. Calloway nodded. The defendant is free. Kennedy stood slowly. Her hands were still trembling, but she clenched them into fists to steady herself. She turned to Reed, who refused to look at her, then to Calloway, who gave her the briefest, almost imperceptible nod. She didn't say a word as she walked out of the courtroom, her grandfather at her side, but everyone in that room knew they had just witnessed something they wouldn't forget. The air outside the courthouse felt different, lighter, warmer, but Kennedy still hadn't fully processed what had happened. She stepped onto the sidewalk, feeling the cold press of reality against her skin. The past few days had been a blur. Confinement, accusation, trial, and now, just like that, she was free. Her grandfather, Elijah Price, walked beside her. His movements were slower these days, but his mind was as sharp as ever. He hadn't said much since they left the courtroom, but she could feel the weight of his presence, the quiet strength in it. Finally, he stopped and turned to her. "You did good in there," Kennedy swallowed. She wasn't sure if she should feel proud or angry. It shouldn't have even come to this. Elijah nodded slowly. No, it shouldn't have. She looked down at her hands. They were still shaking, just slightly. "They wanted to lock me up over nothing. They didn't see it as nothing." She exhaled sharply. "I wasn't even there. They didn't care." He placed a hand on her shoulder, steadying her. "That's the part you need to remember. It was never about evidence. It was about making sure someone took the fall. You just fit the picture they already had in their heads." Kennedy clenched her jaw. "And next time, what if someone doesn't know how to fight back?" Elijah sighed, the lines in his face deepening. "Then they lose." That truth hung between them. She hated it, but then he gave her a small nod. "Unless people like you make sure that changes." Kennedy looked up at him. "People like me?" Elijah's eyes gleamed. "You got up there and took apart their case, piece by piece. You knew more than the prosecutor, more than the judge even. That's not normal, Kennedy. That's a gift." She frowned. "I shouldn't have to know the law just to prove I'm innocent." "No, you shouldn't," he agreed, "but you do know it. And now you know how the system works. More importantly, you know how to break it apart when it's wrong." She hesitated. The words sat heavy in her chest. She had spent days terrified of what might happen, but in that courtroom something had shifted. The fear had turned into something else, something sharper. Resolve. She looked down the street, past the courthouse, past everything behind her. "So what now?" Elijah smiled just slightly. "That's up to you." Kennedy exhaled slowly. The weight of what had just happened, the fight, the injustice, the narrow escape, it was still fresh, but underneath it all, she knew this wasn't the end of the story. She wasn't just walking away from a courtroom, she was walking towards something bigger. Because today she had defended herself, but tomorrow she might be defending someone else. The justice system isn't built to be fair to everyone. Cases like Kennedy's happen more often than we think. But knowing your rights can be the difference between freedom and conviction. If this story made you think, share it, talk about it, and most importantly, learn the law. Because the more you know, the harder it is for the system to work against you. Subscribe for more stories that challenge the way we see justice.